Victoria was at the sink rinsing dishes. J1 was beside her drying them, the way he had quietly started doing without anyone asking, as if standing beside her at that sink at the end of an evening had simply become the natural order of things. Daniel was sitting on his stool at the island behind them, swinging his legs, eating the last of his with the focused dedication of a child. The kitchen was warm. The music was low. Everything was easy and settled, and completely ordinary. And then Daniel looked up from his bowl and said, with the complete innocence of a child, stating something that had been obvious to him for quite some time. "Mommy, is J1 my new dad?" The water kept running. Neither Victoria nor J1 moved for a full second. Then Victoria reached out very slowly and turned off the tap. The kitchen went completely quiet. She turned to look at her son. J1 was looking at the dish in his hand like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the room. Daniel was looking between the two of them with wide, patient eyes, waiting for an answer, completely unbothered by the temperature change he had just caused. Then, finally, Victoria opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Han Jae, a man who had negotiated with dangerous people in high-pressure rooms without his composure shifting by a single degree, cleared his throat quietly and said, "I think your mother is shut of words, Daniel." Daniel considered this, nodded slowly, went back to his dessert. Victoria stared at the sink for 3 full seconds before she turned the tap back on. And J1, very carefully, very deliberately, did make eye contact. Welcome to Afro-Korean Love Stories. Today's episode is all about what happens after the beginning, when love stops being a feeling and starts becoming a choice. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit that like button, subscribe, turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on new story drops, sit back, and allow me draw you into my world of tales. Also, let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. I want to see how far these amazing stories have traveled. Now, let's get back to it. Daniel had been in Seoul for 3 weeks, and he had already claimed the mansion as his own. He had a preferred stool at the kitchen island, the one closest to the stove. A preferred spot in the garden where he sat with Mrs. Han every afternoon while she tended her roses. He had learned 7 Korean words and used all of them with enormous confidence and near zero accuracy. And somewhere in the middle of all of it he had decided, without ceremony or announcement, that Han Jae-won was the most interesting person he had ever met. Jae-won arrived at the mansion on a Wednesday evening to find Daniel sitting at the bottom of the staircase. A dinosaur in each hand. The patient energy of someone with nowhere else to be. "Why are you sitting on the stairs?" "I'm waiting." "For what?" A pause. "I don't know yet." Jae-won looked at him for a moment, then sat down on the step beside him. No deliberation. No performance. Daniel held out the dinosaur in his left hand. "This one is a T-Rex. Most dangerous one. You can hold him." Jae-won took it, examined it seriously. "He looks dangerous." Daniel nodded. "I knew you'd understand." Victoria came looking for her son 2 minutes later and found them side by side on the bottom step. Daniel was explaining the full hierarchy of the dinosaur kingdom. Jae-won was listening with the same attention he gave everything that mattered to him. She stood at the top of the stairs, watched for a moment, said nothing, went back to the kitchen. Grace and Mrs. Han had found each other in the way that certain people find each other, immediately and completely. Their friendship operated through food, gesture, and the shared conviction of 2 grandmothers that everyone around them needed feeding at all times. They sat together in the garden every afternoon, communicating in broken English and broken Korean and understanding each other without effort. Daniel moved between all of them, Victoria in the kitchen, Mrs. Han in the garden, Jae-won wherever Jae-won happened to be, with the ease of a child who had looked at this household and quietly decided it was his. Every evening, without being asked, he set aside the last of whatever Victoria made for dessert, covered it carefully with a cloth the way he had watched her do, and announced to anyone nearby that it was for Jae-won and was not to be touched. Jae-won never mentioned it, but he always ate it. Victoria noticed. She noticed everything. She noticed the way something in Jae-won loosened around Daniel. The way he answered every question the child asked with complete seriousness. Never rushing him, never talking down to him. Patient in a way that didn't look like effort, it just looked like him. Daniel read people the way some children read books. He had decided within the first week that Jae-won was safe. That was the exact word he used one evening when Victoria asked him what he thought. "He's safe, Mommy." Completely certain, like she should have already known. Victoria turned back to her cutting board and said nothing. But that word stayed with her all evening, because it was the same word she had been turning over quietly in her own mind for months. Hearing it from Daniel, unprompted, unbothered, settled something in her that no conversation with J1 had quite managed to settle yet. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when Daniel asked his question at the sink. It was a Thursday evening. The kitchen was winding down, pots cleaned, surfaces wiped, the last of the day settling into quiet. Daniel was at the island finishing his dessert the way he always did, legs swinging, completely at peace with the world. Victoria was at the sink. J1 was beside her. And the atmosphere between them was exactly what it always was at this hour, warm, easy, unhurried. Then Daniel looked up from his bowl. "Mommy." She looked back and answered, already wondering what clever questions he would come up with, and anticipating every possible answer she would respond to. And in that split-second silence, Daniel said, "Mommy, is J1 my new dad?" The question landed the way only a child's question can land, without warning, without cruelty, without any awareness of the weight it carried. Just a boy looking at two people standing side by side at a sink every evening and drawing the most logical conclusion available to him. Victoria turned off the tap. J1 looked at the dish in his hand. "I think your mother is still processing that one," J1 said. Daniel nodded, went back to his dessert. 20 minutes later, Grace appeared and took Daniel upstairs for his bath. Victoria listened to his voice disappear down the hallway, still talking, still asking questions about something, the sound of him filling the house the way it always did. Then the house went quiet. She and J1 were alone in the kitchen. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Victoria picked up a cloth and wiped down the counter she had already wiped twice. J1 leaned against the island with his arms folded and watched her. "You don't have to answer him," J1 said. "He's 6. He's 6 and he's perceptive," Victoria responded almost immediately. "He notices everything. He always has." "What would you tell him?" She stopped wiping, turned around. "What would I tell him?" J1 looked at her steadily. The question sat between them without either of them filling it. But this one was different. This one had a child's voice attached to it, and that changed its weight entirely. "I would tell him," J1 said carefully, "that the adults in his life are figuring things out." "That's not an answer." "No, it's not." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "Daniel doesn't need a definition, J1. He needs consistency. He needs to know that the people around him are going to stay. That is what safe means to him. That is what he was telling me when he used that word." J1 was quiet. "So before we worry about what to tell him," Victoria said, "maybe we should figure out what this actually is." The kitchen was very still. J1 unfolded his arms, straightened up from the island. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, close enough that the careful professional distance they had maintained for months was completely gone. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for a long time now. Direct. Unhurried. Like she was something he had already decided on and was simply waiting for the right moment to say out loud. "I know what I'm doing," he said quietly. "I've known for a while. The question is whether you're ready to stop being careful." Victoria held his gaze. "I have a son. I don't get to stop being careful." "I know that. I'm not asking you to stop protecting him. I'm asking you to let me in. Fully. Not the version of this where we stand at the sink every evening and pretend it's just dinner." Somewhere upstairs, Daniel was laughing at something Grace had said. Victoria looked at this man standing in her kitchen. This complicated, controlled, quietly devoted man who had sat on a staircase with her son and held a toy dinosaur with complete sincerity, who had eaten every dessert Daniel set aside for him without ever making it a moment, who had driven across the city on Wednesday evenings for months before either of them admitted what it was about. "Okay," she responded. Something in his face shifted, quiet and certain. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, slow, deliberate, the first time he had touched her like that, and then dropped his hand and stepped back. "I'll see you tomorrow." He picked up his jacket and walked away. Victoria stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the front door closed. Then she smiled, private and completely unguarded. Then she turned off the kitchen light. The The following days had a different quality to them. Nothing dramatic. Nothing announced. But something between Victoria and J1 had settled into a new shape, more open, less guarded, the careful distance finally gone for good. He still came every evening. But now when he sat on that stool and watched her cook, there was nothing pretending about it. They both knew what it was. And knowing made everything easier and more terrifying in equal measure. Daniel noticed immediately. Children always do. He didn't say anything directly. But he started setting 2 dessert portions aside instead of one for J1 and one for Victoria, and arranging them side by side on the counter with great ceremony. When Victoria pointed this out, he looked at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting for her to catch up. "They go together, Mommy," he said simply, then climbed off his stool and went to find Mrs. Hahn. Victoria stared at the 2 bowls sitting side by side on her counter for a long moment. Mrs. Hahn was in the garden smiling when Victoria brought her afternoon tea. She was moving more slowly than usual. Victoria had noticed it over the past few days. A tiredness that hadn't been there before. A careful way of sitting down as though the act of it required more than it should. "Are you feeling all right?" Victoria asked. Mrs. Hahn waved her hand. "I'm fine. Just tired. Don't fuss." Victoria sat beside her, looked at her carefully. The older woman's color was not quite right. There was something behind her eyes that read less like tiredness and more like something she was managing quietly and alone. Victoria said nothing more, but she watched, and she made a mental note to mention it to J1 that evening. She didn't get the chance. That night at dinner, Mrs. Hahn barely touched her food, the woman who had never once left Victoria's cooking unfinished. Grace noticed. Daniel noticed. Even Daniel, who was busy explaining something important about dinosaurs to J1, paused mid-sentence and looked at Mrs. Hahn with those sharp, perceptive eyes of his. "Halmoni," he said, the Korean word for grandmother that Mrs. Hahn had taught him in his first week and that he had used without self-consciousness ever since. "You didn't eat." Mrs. Hahn smiled at him warmly. "I'm not very hungry tonight, my love." Daniel frowned, looked at Victoria, looked back at Mrs. Hahn, then very carefully pushed his own bowl closer to her side of the table. "You can have some of mine," he said seriously. "It helps." Mrs. Hahn looked at this child, this gap-toothed, earnest, completely generous child, and her eyes filled, not with sadness, with something that looked a great deal like love. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Victoria found J1 standing in the kitchen in the dark. Just standing there, not moving. The city visible through the window behind him. She didn't turn on the light. She just walked in and stood beside him. "She hasn't been right for a few days," Victoria said quietly. "I know," he said. "You should take her to see someone tomorrow." A long pause. "I already called. First thing in the morning." Victoria nodded. They stood in the dark kitchen together for a while, not talking, just standing side by side the way they had stood at that sink for months, but different now. Closer, his arm against hers. Neither moving away. "She'll be fine," Victoria said. Not because she knew it, but because he needed to hear it. J1 said nothing, but his hand found hers in the dark and held it. That was all. The hospital was private, clean, and Mrs. Hahn had been admitted that morning after J1 took her in for what was supposed to be a routine check. It was not routine. The doctors used words that required sitting down to hear. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough that she would need to stay for observation. Several days at minimum, possibly longer. J1 had called Victoria from the hospital waiting room. 3 words. "She's being admitted." Victoria had taken off her coat, told Grace, and been in the car within 10 minutes. By the time she arrived, Mrs. Hahn was already settled in her private room, propped against pillows, looking smaller than Victoria had ever seen her look, but with that characteristic composure intact. The kind of woman who would arrange her dignity around herself like a blanket regardless of the circumstances. Grace and Daniel came in the afternoon. Daniel walked into the hospital room, assessed Mrs. Hahn with those serious eyes of his, walked to her bedside, and took her hand without being asked. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Not very much," Mrs. Hahn replied gently. Daniel nodded, sat down in the chair beside her bed, and held her hand like he had decided that was his job now and had no intention of leaving until it was done. Mrs. Han looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Victoria across the room with an expression that said everything her words didn't need to. Grace waited until Daniel was distracted before she pulled Victoria gently into the corridor. "We can stay," Grace said. "Push the flights back. It's not a problem." Victoria looked at her mother. "Mama, she shouldn't be alone. And neither should you." "She won't be alone. J1 is here." "I'm here." Grace studied her daughter for a moment, the particular way a mother studies her. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "but I want you to call me. Every day." "Every day," Victoria responded almost immediately. They went back in. Daniel was telling Mrs. Han about dinosaurs. Mrs. Han was listening with complete attention, asking questions, her hand still in his. J1 stood at the window with his back to the room, hands in his pockets, looking out at nothing. Victoria crossed the room and stood beside him quietly. "The doctors are confident," she said. "I know what the doctors said." "Then you know it's manageable." He turned to look at her. His eyes were doing that thing they did when he was carrying more than he was saying. She looked small in that bed. Victoria held his gaze. "She's not small." She just looked at. He turned back to the window, but his shoulder stayed against hers. That evening Grace gathered Daniel's things. The original flight stood. They would leave as planned in the morning. Mrs. Han had been clear about that from the moment Grace raised the subject of staying. She had looked at Grace with the polite, unmovable firmness of a woman who had spent 62 years getting her way gracefully. "You go home. You don't have to worry about me," Mrs. Han said. "I am in good hands. And, besides, Daniel has school." Daniel had protested with the full force of his personality. He did not want to leave. He wanted to stay and hold Halmoni's hand and make sure she ate her food. He made this case with considerable passion and several good arguments. Mrs. Han had cupped his face in both her hands. "You know what would make me feel better faster than anything?" Daniel waited. "Knowing you are at home, safe, happy, and eating well." Daniel thought about this seriously. "I'll FaceTime you every day," he said finally. "Every day," Mrs. Han agreed. He hugged her for a long time. She held him just as long. Victoria stood in the doorway of the hospital room watching her son say goodbye to this woman who had taken him in without question, who had taught him Korean words in the garden and listened to his dinosaur theories with genuine interest, and felt the particular emotion that has no clean name. The one that lives between gratitude and grief, and something that feels very much like love. The following morning, Victoria stood outside the departure terminal with Grace and Daniel. Daniel had his backpack on and his dinosaur in his hand, and the expression of a child trying very hard to be brave about something. "You'll call me," he said to his mom. "Every single night, without exception." "And you'll tell Halmoni," I said. "Feel better?" "I'll tell her myself. Every day." He looked at her for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her waist and held on. She bent down and pressed her lips to the top of his head and held him back. "I love you, Mommy," he said into her coat. "I love you more than everything," she said. Grace put her hand on Victoria's shoulder briefly. The touch of a mother who understood exactly what her daughter was carrying and wanted her to know she was not carrying it alone. Then she took Daniel's hand, and they walked through the departure doors. Victoria watched until she couldn't see them anymore. Then she turned around and drove back to the hospital. She found J1 exactly where she expected to find him, in the corridor outside his mother's room, leaning against the wall, phone in hand but not looking at it. He looked up when she appeared. "You came back." "Of course I came back," she replied. Something in his face shifted. Small but visible. He pushed off the wall. "She's awake. She's been asking for you." Mrs. Han was sitting up in bed when Victoria walked in. More color in her face than the day before. Her eyes sharper. She watched Victoria settle into the chair beside her bed. "You didn't have to come back," Mrs. Han said. "I know. I wanted to," Victoria replied. Mrs. Han reached out and patted her hand. They sat quietly for a moment. The room was warm. The afternoon light came through the blinds in long, soft lines across the floor. "Can I tell you something?" Mrs. Han said. Victoria looked at her. "Of course." Mrs. Han was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with the care of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say them. "Do you remember the first time we met? Your first morning in my kitchen?" "I remember everything about that morning," Victoria said. I knew who you were before that morning, Mrs. Hahn said. I had tasted your food 6 months before, at a private dinner. I didn't know your name then, just that the food was extraordinary. I asked around, found out who made it, and I passed your details to one of my son's trusted executives. I told them to hire you for one of his events.
She paused.
It's not what you think. I just wanted my son eating well. I wanted good people around him. I wasn't thinking beyond that. Victoria was very still. I didn't plan any of this, Mrs. Hahn said. I didn't arrange your meeting thinking it would become what it became. I just liked your food, and I liked the little I had seen of you, and I thought, here's someone who brings something good into a room. She squeezed Victoria's hand. I had no idea, but I am so glad. I'm happy it turned out the way it did. Victoria looked at this small, elegant woman in her hospital bed. This woman who had sat at her kitchen island every Tuesday for months, who had quietly created the conditions for something neither of them had been able to predict, who had kept this information to herself not out of calculation but out of the simple belief that some things unfold better when left alone. Victoria felt something settle in her chest. Not quite surprise. Not quite relief. Something in between, the feeling of a thing that had always been slightly unclear coming suddenly into focus. You never said anything, Victoria said. It wasn't mine to say, Mrs. Hahn said simply. What happened between you and my son happened because of who you both are, not because of me. Victoria looked down at their joined hands for a moment. Thank you, she said quietly. Mrs. Hahn smiled. Thank your grandmother. Her recipe is what started all of this. Victoria laughed, real and sudden and completely unexpected in a hospital room. Mrs. Hahn laughed too. And for a moment the room felt less like a hospital and more like a kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. Now, before we proceed any further, Mrs. Hahn arranged the meeting that started everything. But she says she had no plan beyond good food and good people. Do you believe her? And knowing that the whole thing began with a grandmother's recipe passed down through generations, what does that tell you about the kind of love that was always meant to find its way into that kitchen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story has you this invested already, hit that subscribe button. Let's find out what really is going on with Mrs. Hahn, and if there is not a cause for alarm. Let's see how J1 handles seeing his mom looking fragile and small on that hospital bed. You don't want to miss it. The hospital became part of their rhythm. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just gradually, the way most significant things happen, until visiting Mrs. Hahn became as natural as the kitchen had once been. Victoria came every afternoon without fail. She brought food in containers that the nurses pretended not to notice. Mrs. Hahn's Tuesday pepper soup, the black garlic rice she had eaten every week for months, small careful portions of everything that had become familiar and comforting. J1 came every evening. He had stopped going back to his own apartment. It happened without announcement, his overnight bag appearing in one of the mansion's guest rooms one evening, more of his things arriving quietly over the following days. Nobody commented on it. It simply became the arrangement. He was closer to the hospital from the mansion. That was the practical reason. It was also not the only reason. But nobody needed to say that out loud. Victoria would pass him in the hospital corridor most evenings, her leaving as he arrived, or both of them there at the same time, gravitating toward each other the way they always had. They would sit together in the small waiting area near his mother's room, drinking bad hospital coffee from paper cups, talking about his mother, about Daniel's daily video calls, about everything and nothing the way they had always talked. It was different from the kitchen, more exposed. The hospital had a way of stripping pretense, something about the fluorescent lighting and the particular quiet of medical corridors that made small talk feel impossible and honesty feel inevitable. They talked about things they hadn't talked about before. He told her more about his father, the coldness of him, the standard of him, the particular loneliness of growing up in a house where love was transactional. She told him more about her marriage, not the bitterness of the end, but the sadness of it. The grief of watching something that had once been good become something neither of them could save. He listened completely. She talked without editing herself. One evening he arrived to find her asleep in the chair beside his mother's bed, her head tilted to one side, one hand still loosely holding Mrs. Hahn's. His mother was awake. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway and put one finger to her lips. He stood in the doorway looking at the two of them for a long moment. Mrs. Han pointed at Victoria, then pointed at him, then raised her eyebrows in the unmistakable expression of a woman who had been saying the same thing for months and was running out of patience. Jae-won crossed the room quietly, sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. His mother looked at him with the particular look she reserved for moments when she felt he was being deliberately obtuse. "She fell asleep holding your hand," he said quietly. "I know," Mrs. Han whispered. "I've been watching her for 20 minutes. You should have woken her." "Why would I do that?" Jae-won looked at Victoria sleeping in the chair, her face completely relaxed. All the composure she carried so carefully through every waking hour simply gone. Just a woman, tired, having given everything she had to a day that asked a great deal of her. "Jae-won," his mother said softly. He looked at her. "Stop wasting time." He looked back at Victoria. "I hear you," he said. "You hear me, and you sit there," Mrs. Han said. "Hearing is not the same as doing." Victoria stirred in the chair, blinked slowly, registered where she was, registered Jae-won sitting across from her, and sat up quickly with a slightly disoriented expression of someone who had not intended to fall asleep. "I wasn't sleeping," she said immediately. "Of course not," Mrs. Han said. "I was just resting my eyes." "For 25 minutes," Jae-won said. Victoria looked at him. He looked back at her. The corner of his mouth moved. She pressed her lips together to stop herself from smiling and failed completely. Mrs. Han watched the two of them with a satisfied expression of a woman watching something she had waited a very long time to see. The weeks passed. Mrs. Han improved steadily. The doctors were pleased. The color came back to her face. Her appetite returned, aided considerably by Victoria's containers arriving every afternoon. She started sitting up more. Started asking for her phone so she could video call Daniel, who reported on every call that he was eating well and that he had taught his class 3 Korean words and that he missed Halmoni very much, and was she eating her vegetables. Mrs. Han assured him she was eating everything. "Victoria makes sure," Daniel said seriously. "She doesn't let anyone not eat." "I know," Mrs. Han said, looking across the room at Victoria with warm eyes. "I know she does." The night before Mrs. Han was due to come home, Jae-won and Victoria sat together in the hospital corridor long after visiting hours. The nurses had learned